Okay, so welcome everyone for today's talk in the CMI seminar series. We are very happy to have Agnit Banerjee from TIFR Center in Bangalore. He will speak today about obstacle problem for the fractional heat equation. Please go ahead, Agnit.
All right. First, I would like to thank you, Krishna, for your very kind invitation. So I graduated from CMI back in 2008. So since then, I have not been there. So it's kind of quite endearing to touch base once again. So the title of my talk is The Obstacle Problem for the Fractional Heat Equation, and it's based on a series of, or a couple of joint works with Donatella Danieli, Nicola Garofalo, and Arshak Petroshev. So to begin with, I will describe what is the so-called classical obstacle problem. So this is a picture which is somewhat of a shady picture, but nevertheless, this is the best I could do. So what you do is that you want to find an elastic membrane that stretches across an obstacle. So that means that what you want to do is to minimize the surface energy or in surface tension, or in particular the surface area in this case. So what you would be looking at is this quantity, which is the surface area of a graph corresponding to the function v, and you want to have the constraint that it lies above an obstacle, which is psi. So that in that picture before, the psi was this bump below, and then you have some given boundary values. So if you didn't have any constraint, what you would be looking for is the Plateau problem, where you minimize the surface area, and the solution is the so-called minimal surface, whose mean curvature is 0. So now when the gradient is small, if you linearize this, so what you end up is with this quantity, which is 1 plus half grad v square. And in that case, the simplified linear model would look like this, where you minimize the Dirichlet energy subject to the same constraint and with some given boundary conditions. So this is kind of a repetition, but psi is so-called the obstacle. Now, although it may appear that this is a lot simpler one because I have linearized it, but for practitioners in this theory, one would know is that once you are able to show that the gradient is held continuous or some basic regularity for the gradient, then you know very well that the theory essentially linearizes. So it's kind of almost suffices to look at this linear model in that sense. So I will try, at this point I cannot be precise, but hopefully it will be slightly clearer when I look at further analysis. So to further understand the situation, so let's look at the one-dimensional picture. So what you have is the obstacle, which looks like this wave, and then you have a solution to this obstacle problem. And now if you look at this picture, you see that the solution is only touching the obstacle at so-called concave points. And this is something that should be intuitively obvious, because if it were to touch the obstacle at so-called these low bumps, then the graph has to come down. And in that case, inevitably, you will be increasing the surface area, or more so the Dirichlet energy. And this is something which at an analytic level can be rigorously justified by looking at the first variation. So what you do is that given this solution, because you have this unilateral constraint, that is you have an obstacle from below, so you can perturb it up, and then when you compute the first variation, what you get is precisely that the second derivative of u has to be less than equal to 0. And if you look at these points where the solution is not touching the obstacle, here you can perturb the test function both above and below, right? So that would mean that here you will get the condition that the second derivative is 0. So in higher dimension, this reads off as that solution to this obstacle problem generically has to be superharmonic, and at the points where it's not touching the obstacle, it has to be harmonic. So this information can be written in this condensed manner, which is like insisting minimum of u minus psi, where psi is the obstacle, I would repeat again, comma minus of Laplacian u has to be 0. Now, this obstacle problem is an example of a so-called variational inequality, but nevertheless, for the Laplacian, the solution also has a non-variational characterization. So it is in some sense the least superharmonic function. When I say superharmonic function, it means that the trace of the Hessian, which is the Laplacian, is less than equal to 0. So the solution of the obstacle problem can be characterized as the least superharmonic function, which is staying above the obstacle. Now, the boundary of the coincidence set, which is the boundary of the set where u is equal to psi, is referred to as the free boundary, and it is often called the interface, and that I will denote with gamma. Now, again, this obstacle problem is a model problem for a wider variety of problems referred to as the free boundary problems. So another very well-known free boundary problem would be if you put some ice into water and then you want to understand how, and suppose the outside temperature is fixed, then you would want to understand how the ice melts into water. In particular, you would be wanting to understand how the interface, the ice-water interface, changes with time. And the other thing that you would want to understand is that whether the temperature is continuous across the interface. And this is popularly called the Stefan's problem. And it turns out by using a certain transformation, one can view the classical obstacle problem in some sense as the stationary counterpart of the Stefan's problem. So as I said, so two fundamental questions would arise. One would be, as I said, for the ice-water melting problem, you would want to understand whether the temperature is continuous. So which is to say, in the case of classical obstacle problem, what is the regularity of the solution, or so to speak, the optimal regularity of the solution that you would want to understand. And once you have settled the question of optimal regularity, you would want to understand how this interface changes. Or in the stationary case, it would not change, but you would want to know what is the regularity of this interface. So that is the regularity of the free boundary in the stationary problem. So in order to understand the optimal regularity of the solution, let's go back to that picture. So if you look at this picture, what you see is that at the coincidence set, so let's think of it in the higher dimension. On the coincidence set, what you have is that the Laplacian of the u has to match the Laplacian of psi because it's touching, right? So, and there it is superharmonic. And by the time it leaves the obstacle at the no contact set, it has to be harmonic. So in the very general situation, you have to have that the Laplacian has a jump by the time you leave the free boundary. So the best regularity that is possible in this case would be the C11. And so the natural question arises, is it achieved? So the answer to this question is yes. And this was first proved by Jean Fréchet in 1972. And then later on, it was generalized by Brézis and Tyndall-Lehrer to more general variational inequalities. Now I'll just give a little bit of an idea how you think of this regularity. So what we do is that, so let's go back to that picture. So as I said that the solution to the classical obstacle problem can be realized as in a non-variational way as the least superharmonic function which stays above the obstacle. So using that, what you can show is that the solutions are quasi-convex, which is to say that at every point on the graph, you can touch it by a paraboloid from below. So that means that the pure second derivatives are bounded from below. And now from the fact that the solution to this obstacle problem is superharmonic, which is to say that the Laplacian of u is less than or equal to 0. If you combine these two information, you immediately obtain that the pure second derivatives are also bounded from above. So with that, you obtain that the solution is C11. And there are many other approaches which are kind of similar, but at some level different. And they're due to Luis Caparelli, who was able to show that if you give me any basic regularity of the obstacle, whether it be C alpha or C1 alpha, then the solution has to leave the contact set at the same rate. And this was sort of done much later. So the work of Fréchet and Brézis and Tyndall-Lehrer covers the case when the obstacle has high regularity, so to speak. Now, the next question is, anyway, so what is the regularity of the free boundary? And this question, it turns out, is much deeper. So in order to understand why it is deep, so let's look at another picture. So this is again a lot more hazy, but this is the best I could do. So as I said, that the solution is only going to touch at the superharmonic points, right? So locally, this is how the picture would be. So you have this bump, and then you have a solution across, which touches over here. And now what I do is that I take some arbitrary closed set over here in the domain, and then I push this obstacle up till it touches the solution in this closed set. So I go from this picture to this picture. So now, a priori, you have a new obstacle problem because the obstacle has changed. But then, as I said, that the solution has this characterization that it is the least superharmonic function which is above that obstacle. So that doesn't change. So you have a different obstacle, but the same solution, so to speak. And now what I have done is that I have introduced a new interface, so to speak, which is the boundary of this arbitrary closed set. And that can be very wide, right? And so therefore, in general, you cannot expect any regularity of the interface. And this is a problem over here because now I have introduced a new set of contact points where the superharmonicity degenerates because these are the harmonic points of the obstacle, so to speak. So therefore, this heuristic, or I mean, in fact, it can be made more rigorous. This suggests that in order to have a reasonable theory, a reasonable smoothness theory of the free boundary, what you should minimally insist is that the obstacle be strictly superharmonic. And then by a comparison argument, it can be shown that in such a case, you have that the obstacle, the solution, strictly separates from the obstacle at a so to speak, quadratic rate. So, and now the next question would be what happened if you now put this basic assumption, minimal assumption that is required in view of this previous picture. Suppose you insist that the obstacle is strictly superharmonic. And to that, it was shown by Luis Caffarelli in his groundbreaking work back in 1977 that in such a situation, you have the following regularity result for the free boundary. So you take a free boundary point where the coincidence set, so to speak, has a positive density. Now I will describe what is positive density, so to speak, in the next slide, but let's assume it for now. So near such point where the coincidence set, so to speak, has positive density, you have that the free boundary is smooth or even real analytic depending on the obstacle. Again, I mean, everything is subject to how regular you want the obstacle to be. So
excuse me, I have a question. This theorem holds when psi is superharmonic.
Strictly superharmonic,
okay,
because the previous picture that I had suggested that if you have that the contact set, the superharmonicity degenerates. That is to speak that it touches the solution at the in an harmonic fashion. Then the boundary of that set can be very wide, because I can always pick up some closed subset where there was a priori no contact, and then I push up the obstacle to touch precisely there. So then I would generate or manufacture, so to speak, a new set of free boundary points, which is the boundary of this closed set. And so that can be in general very wide. So you want the superharmonicity to be strict, because without that, I mean, it's very hard to have a reasonable theory. So does that answer?
Superharmonicity of psi does not necessarily mean that psi itself is, what degree of differentiability, if any, does that?
Okay, so here you assume that you have as much of regularity that you want. So for all these theorems that I would mention, you can even assume psi to be as smooth as you want. So that would not make the problem less interesting, as we would see.
No, when you say gamma psi is smooth, does that involve smoothness assumptions on psi?
Well, yes, so the obstacle has to have at least smoothness for the free boundary to have smoothness. However, even if you take the psi to be real analytic, the best regularity that you get for the solution is only C11 in view of what we had before. Because at
but gamma psi, what is gamma? Gamma psi is the coincidence set, right? Or what is gamma psi? Sorry.
So gamma psi is the boundary of the coincidence set. So you have a coincidence set, and then you have the boundary of such a set where the solution leaves the obstacle. So you want to understand that interface. What is the regularity of that interface, of the smoothness over there?
Okay, thank you.
All right. So what was I saying? Anyway, okay. So let me repeat this here. So at free boundary points where you have that the coincidence set has positive density, the free boundary is smooth or even real analytic. And here you insist that the obstacle be as smooth as you want. So I should mention over here that Caffarelli showed that the free boundary is C1 alpha. And then from C1 alpha to C infinity, it follows by a bootstrap argument, which is based on Hodograph transform, and that was previously due to Inderleder, Nirenberg, and Sprague. So what that does is that, so you have this obstacle problem, then you, at a free boundary point, you use an intrinsic transformation, which is to say that a transformation which depends on the obstacle. And then you transform this problem into a fixed boundary problem for a fully nonlinear PD. And then once you have good information of the regularity for that boundary problem, you can pull that information, and that gives you more smoothness of the free boundary. Now, there is a very recent alternate approach to the higher regularity starting from C1 alpha, and that is due to De Silva and Sabine based on higher order boundary Harnack inequalities. And it would not be an understatement to mention over here that such a new approach has really bettered furthered our understanding of the regularity theory for the free boundary, and it has also provided a new perspective in, so to speak, boundary elliptic regularity theory. So this is what I mean by positive density. So here you have the coincidence set where U is equal to psi, and this is the point x0. So you see that if you zoom in, the limit would be 1 where you have that, assume that the free boundary is nice. The limit would be 1 where you have that this free boundary converges to the tangent plane at x0. And then on one side, you will have the coincidence set. And on the other side, you will have that u is bigger than psi. So if you subtract of the obstacle, what you should insist, what you should expect is that the blow up limit, that is if you zoom in the picture, and that can be rigorously defined in terms of quadratic blow ups, the limiting solution would be a half space solution, which is, say, suppose the tangent plane over here is xn equals to 0. So the half space solution would be, say, 1 by 2 xn plus square. So if you insist that at the free boundary point, the Laplacian of psi is equal to -1, so to speak, just to have a normalized problem. And the other scenario that can happen is that the coincidence set can become skinny and skinny by the time you reach this free boundary point. That is to say that you possibly can have cusp-like singularities near the free boundary. And there are examples due to Scheffer, which shows that such singularities can happen, and there is no way to avoid it. So in that sense, the theory of Caffarelli is more or less optimal. Now, nevertheless, you would still want to understand what happens at singular points. Of course, you can have cusp, but still you would want to understand whether, at least from a geometric measure theoretic point of view, whether you can have some good stratification results of the singular set. That is, whether you can show that the singular sets are contained in some lower dimensional manifolds. And this is something that does happen, and that was shown by Caffarelli in 1998. He showed that the points where the coincidence set has zero density are contained in lower dimensional C1 manifolds. So in the literature, the free boundary points of positive density are referred to as the regular points, as the name suggests, because there you can get a good regularity theory, and points of zero density are called singular points. Now, just to give you an idea about how you go about proving the regularity, or how did Luis Caffarelli do it. So he first showed that the second derivative, the pure second derivatives. So first, as I said, that the solution has this non-variational characterization that gives you quasi-convexity estimates, which is to say that the pure second derivatives are bounded from below by some negative constant. But by an Harnack inequality approach applied to the second derivatives, and it's a very clever approach, Luis Caffarelli was able to show that by the time you reach the free boundary, you have that the pure second derivatives become non-negative. So that is to say that by the time you blow up these solutions, zoom in this picture, the blow up limits should be 1, which are convex. And once you have that the blow up limits are convex, then you would know that the first order directional derivatives will have a cone of monotonicity.
Sorry, can you explain blow up limits once more?
So the blow up limit would be, so let's look at a model problem. So, well, I should have written this information over here. So once you subtract of the obstacle, as I said that for any reasonable theory, you need that the Laplacian of psi be strictly non-negative. So let's assume that the Laplacian of psi is identically equal to -1. Although this theory, as it would turn out, because it's a small perturbation theory, it really doesn't change, even if the Laplacian of psi changes a bit. So for simplicity, let's assume that the Laplacian of psi is -1. So if you subtract of the obstacle, what you get is that is, if you look at v, which is u minus psi, you will have that the Laplacian of v will be minus of Laplacian of psi, which should be +1 on the set where v is bigger than 0, because that is precisely the set where u is bigger than psi. So in terms of v, you will have that the new criterion would be that in the set where v is bigger than 0, Laplacian of v will be 1, and on the coincidence set, the Laplacian of v would be 0. So now what you would, as I said, that you have obtained that the solution is C11, right? And in the coincidence set, the solution and the obstacle, which in this case is now 0, has matched up to first derivative. So if you write down the Taylor expansion, what you get is that the solution separates at a quadratic rate, which is to say that if you take a ball of radius r centered at this pre-boundary point, then the L infinity norm of v grows at most like r square up to a constant. So therefore, what I would do is that, and then, and this is something that I'm hiding. Now, out of this, by some comparison principle approach, by comparing with quadratic functions, you can show that not only that the L infinity norm is bounded in a quadratic manner, but in fact, the solution separates from this free boundary point at a precise quadratic rate, which is to say that if you take the L infinity norm, it is both bounded from below and above by r square. So now what I would do is that I will rescale the problem as v of rx divided by r square, and I will call it vr of x. What I have done is that I have taken something which is of size R. I have now I've now magnified it and made it size 1, right? And then as it would turn out by the scaling invariance of the problem, this VR of X is also a solution to the same obstacle problem. And because you're able to show that the pure second derivatives, they become non-negative by the time you reach the free boundary. So in terms of this VR, because you're blowing the picture, you would get that VR converges to some V naught, and that comes from some stable estimates, which gives you the desired compactness properties, that up to a subsequence, these VRs converges to some V naught. And if you apply the chain rule, you would see that the second derivative of VR would be, because the R square and R square kills, would be the second derivative of V at R of X, right? So then by the time as R goes to 0, this VR goes to some V naught, which becomes strictly convex. So the blow up limits are convex. So that would mean, is that clear?
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so the blow up limits are convex. So that would mean that the pure directional derivatives have a cone of monotonicity. So once you have a cone of monotonicity, then by a very clever compactness argument, again, all these aspects are very deep, and I don't think I'm doing proper justice to it, but nevertheless, just to give you some idea how to think about it. So by using some compactness arguments, you are able to show that if your solution is close to some global solution, then you have a comparable cone of monotonicity for your original solution near a free boundary point. That would mean that you can touch the free boundary point both from above and below by a cone of a fixed angle. And that just tells you that the free boundary is Lipschitz, right? And then once you have achieved this Lipschitz character of the free boundary, one way to go from Lipschitz to C1 alpha is by some boundary Harnack type inequalities applied to first order derivatives. So what the boundary Harnack inequality tells you is that if you give me a Lipschitz domain, and if you give me two non-negative functions which are 0 on a portion of this boundary, on the portion of this Lipschitz boundary, then the ratio of these two harmonic functions become Helder. And so if you apply this to the pure first order derivatives which lie in that cone, and because you have the cone of monotonicity, those pure first order derivatives would be non-negative in that region. So if you take the ratio, that would be Helder. And if you write it as a graph, and you can just immediately read off from there, that would just tell you that the free boundary can be represented not just by a Lipschitz graph, but by a C1 alpha graph. And the second thing would be how you get some regularity results for the singular points, or so to speak, the stratification results. And this turns out to be a much harder problem. And that's why you see that the singular points were only addressed much later. And this is because singular points are unstable, so to speak, under small perturbations. And even to show uniqueness of blowups, this is a very hard problem. And this is quite analogous to the theory of minimal surfaces, in the sense that it's really not a soft argument. So if I give you a minimal surface and if I start blowing up, the first thing that I want to know is that the blow up limit is a plane and not a cone. And based on that, you have this theory of a regularity theory for minimal surfaces, that cones only appear beyond a certain dimension, and accordingly you have that the singular set is trapped in lower Hausdorff dimension. But before that, even to know that first you have a blow up limit which is a plane or hyperplane, and the second question that you want to know is that if you take different sequences of blow ups, because when you apply the so-called compactness theorem, which is the Ardella-Ascoli theorem, you would only have that up to a subsequence something converges, right? And then it may happen that if you take different sequences of blow-ups, you can have different tangent planes. And this is not unthinkable in a generic scenario, because what can happen is that you can have very strange spirals, or you can have a very complicated mosquito coil. So the first thing to show is that such a thing doesn't happen. That is, if you zoom in the picture, the zero set should not rotate. So all I'm trying to say is that in order to show uniqueness of blowups, you have to do something. It doesn't come for free. So in this context of free boundary problems, what Luis Caffarelli did was that to show the uniqueness of blowups, he used fairly deep monotonicity formulas referred to as the Alt-Caffarelli-Friedman monotonicity formula. And again, in both scenarios, both for the understanding of the regular and singular points, as I said, there are several parallels with the theory of minimal surfaces. So now, well, before that, I should also mention that there is an alternate approach to regularity at regular points, and that came up in the work of George Weiss in 1998. And this is an approach based on epiperimetric inequality. So it is an approach which says that if I have, so I should also mention over here that the regular and the singular points have equivalent characterization. So let's go back to that picture. So if you subtract off the obstacle, so regular points can be equivalently characterized by saying that a certain sequence of rescalings, or for that matter, any sequence of rescalings, because once you show the uniqueness of the limit, converges to half-space solutions. And over here, if you say take any sequence of blow-ups, because this coincidence set becomes skinnier and skinnier in measure, so by the time you take the blow-up limit, it disappears. So here the limit you expect it to be a quadratic polynomial, but the zero would only be concentrated at this x0, which you can always translate and make it the origin. So these are the equivalent characterizations. So at a regular point, you know that the blow-up limits are half-space solutions with respect to a certain tangent plane. So what you do is that you have these representative half-space solutions. So the epiperimetric inequality says that if you have a homogeneous function which is close to these familiar global solutions, or rather close enough, then depending on that order of closeness, you can always find another function which has the same boundary values, where the so-called Weiss energy decays by a strictly speaking geometric factor. And now, if you combine it with another quantity, which is the so-called Weiss type monotonicity, that tells you that a certain quantity called the Weiss energy, which also appears in epiperimetric, is bounded. If you combine it with this geometric decay, what you are able to show is that this Weiss energy, it decays at a Helder rate, which is dictated by, and the whole Helder exponent is dictated by the geometric decay. And with that, what you're able to show is that if you go from point to point, then the tangent plane only changes, or the normal to the tangent plane only changes in a Helder way, which is to say that from nowhere, you right away go to C1 alpha. So this is, so in that sense, it's a different approach. And again, this is inspired by the work on Reifenberg in the late 50s for minimal surfaces. So there is a similar epiperimetric inequality with which Reifenberg was able to show the uniqueness of the blow-ups of minimal surfaces in certain cases. So now I turn my attention to the fractional world. So it would be not wrong to say that there has been an increasing interest. So let me just see how much time I have. Okay. So in recent times, there has been an increasing interest in obstacle problems for non-local operators such as the fractional Laplacian. So the basic model is, so you just want to mimic what happens in the local case. So you look for the least S superharmonic function which stays above an obstacle, which is to say that you look at this criterion. And just for some technical reasons, so that the non-local operator is defined, you insist that the solution decays, or the function decays at infinity in a certain way. So just for the sake of completeness, the fractional Laplacian can be defined in many ways. So one way to define it is at the level of the Fourier transform in this manner. So it is an ordered 2S operator. So again, in this case, the function psi is the obstacle. So I will have these notations. So I will denote by lambda the coincidence set. And then the boundary of the coincidence set will be denoted by gamma. And these kind of problems arise in a variety of contexts like elasticity, probability and math finance, etc. So in 2007, Caffarelli and Silvestre introduced a remarkable extension procedure which allows to convert problems involving the fractional Laplacian into a local problem which involves a certain Dirichlet to Neumann map. So what you do is I will just briefly describe it. So you take some u for which the fractional Laplacian makes sense, and then you solve this following boundary value problem. You add an extra variable, which is this y, so that at y equals to 0, it has to equal little u. And this a is related to the order of the fractional Laplacian in this manner. So a would be 1 minus 2s. And then it turns out that the fractional Laplacian applied to little u can be realized as the weighted Neumann derivative of this capital U up to some constant. So therefore, in terms of the extension problem, the obstacle problem can be reformulated in the following way. That is, in the set where y is bigger than 0, it has to solve this pre-equation. On the set where y equals to 0, capital U equals little u, so it has to stay above the obstacle. And then you have this sign condition for the weighted Neumann derivative, which is to say that in terms of little u, the solution has to be generically S superharmonic. And on the set where it doesn't touch the obstacle, you should have the solution be S harmonic. So in terms of the weighted Neumann derivative, you should have that in terms of capital U, it should be 0. So these are called the Signorini conditions. So it is a thin obstacle problem because now we have that the obstacle lives on the thin set, which is y equals to 0. And the synonymy problem corresponds to the case when a equals to 0. So if you write in terms of s, you will get that s equals to half. So at a local level, the synonymy problem tells you, or at least a simplified version of the synonymy problem tells you, is that if you want to minimize the Dirichlet energy, subject to the constraint that you have an obstacle on a portion of the boundary. So if that portion of the boundary is flat, what you see is that at that local level, it is equivalent to the classical obstacle problem for the half Laplacian. Now, for such a problem, the known results are as follows. So in 2007, Caffarelli, Salsa, and Silvestre showed that the optimal regularity of the solutions, which is C1s. So in the case when s equals to 1, you see that we were able to show that we had that the solution was C11. So it's kind of analogous because now the order of the operator is s. And furthermore, they were able to show that at free boundary points of minimal order of contact with the obstacle. So now once you know that the solution is C1s, so at the coincidence set, it will match the obstacle up to first derivative. So if you write down the Taylor expansion, you will have that the solution can only separate from the obstacle at a rate which is at least 1 plus s, if not more. And what they were able to show was that if at certain free boundary points, and there are examples as well, that at free boundary points where the separation happens at a rate which is precisely 1 plus s, then at such points the free boundary is C1 alpha. And these are now the so-called regular points in this non-local obstacle problem. Now, I should mention over here as well that s equals to half was previously addressed by Athanasopoulos and Caffarelli, and also by Athanasopoulos, Caffarelli, and Salsa by different methods. Now, in 2008, Garofalo and Petrosian studied the singular points, which is so-called the points of zero density of the coincidence set, and at such points they were able to obtain similar stratification results similar to that of the obstacle problem. That is, the singular set is contained in C1 manifolds of dimension, which is dictated by the dimension of the singular point. And this is an aspect that I will address later. And again, for general S, it was more recent by Garofalo and Rosotan. And finally, you would want to understand what is whether you have high regularity of the regular part of the free boundary, because Caffarelli, Salsa, and Silvestre were only able to show that it is C1 alpha. In fact, that is already a lot. But nevertheless, you are interested in the question of high regularity, and that was addressed much later. So first by Koch, Petrosian, and Shi for s equals to half, where they were able to successfully adapt the Hodograph transform of Indeler and Dirain-Bogans-Krupp to this thin obstacle problem. But again, I should mention over here is that it's really not the Hodograph transform, but a certain partial version of the Hodograph transform. And it's quite deeper in a certain sense. And also there are alternate approaches by De Silva and Savine, which are based on adaptation of higher order boundary Harnack to this thin setting. And then for general S, these results were later on generalized by Koch, Roland, and Shi, and also by Zaveri and Neumeier, where they were able to extend the approach of De Silva and Savine to general S. And all these extensions are, so to speak, quite delicate because you are forced to understand a shorter theory for a degenerate elliptic problem where you have that the boundary is a thin slit. So in particular, it can be a slit. So where you would know that the solution can separate at fractional orders, so to speak. So in this lecture, I would focus on a thin obstacle problem, which enters the analysis in a similar way when you study the obstacle problem for the fractional heat. So the fractional heat, similar to the elliptic case at the level of the Fourier transform, can be defined in this manner. So it's an order 2s operator with respect to the parabolic scalings. An alternate approach would be by Bochner's subordination principle using the heat semigroup. And this was done by Balakrishnan back in 1965. So in fact, Balakrishnan's approach works for more general closed operators in Banach spaces. So in both cases, it gives you the same operator. So again, an analogous fractional heat obstacle problem would be like this, where you look for the least S supercaloric function, which stays above the obstacle. So our main results are as follows. So we are able to show that for this problem, the time derivative is L infinity, and at every time level, the solution is C1s. And this corresponds to the optimal regularity that was earlier obtained by Caffarelli, Salsa, and Silvestre. And then we show that at points of minimal order of contact, because now that you have the solution is C1s, so it will match at a coincidence set, it will match the obstacle up to first derivative. So it can only separate from the obstacle at a rate which is at least 1 plus s. So at points of minimal order of contact, which is to say 1 plus s, we are able to show that the free boundary is C1 alpha. And at free boundary points of zero density, which are the so-called singular points, we are again able to show that the singular set is contained in lower dimensional C1 manifolds. And that corresponds to the stratification result for the singular set. Now, when s equals to half, in an earlier joint work with Mariana and Andrew Zeller, we were able to show that the regular free boundary is smooth. Now, for general s in 0 and 1, this is still a work in progress with Arshak, Nicola, and Donatella. Finally, I should mention that some global regularity estimates, which depends on the boundary conditions, but this problem has been earlier obtained by Athanasopoulos, Caffarelli, and Villakis, and they were also able to get some C1 alpha regularity at so-called hyperbolic free boundary points. Now, our approach and treatment is somewhat different because one of our objectives, besides studying the regularity, is the systematic classification of free boundary points, and that requires a blow-up analysis. So for that, we need local estimates which don't depend on the boundary conditions. So in that sense, we cannot rely on the results of Athanasopoulos, Caffarelli, and Villakis because we have to localize such estimates. And our approach is quite different because in their case, the first thing that they show is some basic quasi-convexity estimates in space and time, and that plays a very crucial role in their analysis. And the second thing is the hyperbolic free boundary points are points where the solution separates from the obstacle at a rate 1 plus s, but with respect to the hyperbolic scaling, which is to say that you scale the space and the time variable the same way. So to begin with, in that sense, our free boundary points are more general because we only insist that the solution separates from the obstacle at a rate 1 plus s, but with respect to the parabolic scalings. So that is, in the space variable, you scale like r, but in the time, you scale like r square. And that is kind of tailor-made for the parabolic geometry, and because we have a parabolic obstacle problem, so to speak. So again, similar to the elliptic case, we look at our approach is via the extension problem, and the extension problem for the fractional heat was developed recently, which is analogous to the elliptic case of Caffarelli and Silvestre, by Nystrom and Sande, and independently by Stinga and Toria. So let me just look at my time. Okay. So in fact, what you have is a very similar one. You solve a degenerate parabolic PD now, and such that the boundary values are equal to little u, and then the fractional heat applied to little u equals the same weighted Neumann derivative applied to the capital U. So the degenerate operator looks like this. So capital U is the extended function. So where you have the extended variable y, it solves this pre-equation in y bigger than 0. And on the set where y equals to 0, it has to stay above the obstacle because that equals little u, which is as in our non-local formulation. And then you have this generic sign condition for the weighted Neumann derivative, which is to say that little u is generically S supercaloric. And on the set where it's not touching the obstacle, it has to be S caloric, or in terms of the weighted Neumann derivative, you have to insist that it equals 0. So again, it's a thin obstacle problem because the obstacle lies on the thin set. Now, I should mention that when A equals to 0 or when equivalently S equals to half, this problem was previously studied by Danieli, Garofalo, Petrosian, and Doe. Now, the techniques and proofs in our works, I mean, again, our works builds on a lot of previous works. So they are in particular inspired to the work, a fundamental monotonicity property first discovered by Fred Almgren for harmonic functions, which says that, I mean, you have a certain quantity, which is a function of R, defined in terms of the Dirichlet energy, and Almgren was able to show that such a quantity is monotone. So in particular, you will have that there is a limit as R goes to 0. And this limit as R goes to 0 for harmonic function captures the first. So if you write, you know that the harmonic function is real analytic. So what you do is that you write down the Taylor expansion, then you can group it into harmonic function, harmonic polynomials of a certain order. So this Almgren's frequency limit as R goes to 0 captures the degree of the first non-zero harmonic polynomial in the Taylor expansion. And then there is a parabolic version of Almgren's monotonicity formula that came up in the work of Poon in 1996 for solution of the heat equation. And this quantity also captures a similar information. So if you again write down the Taylor expansion for a caloric function, then if you look at the first non-zero caloric polynomial, or the first degree of the non-zero caloric polynomial, that is, and that is what is captured by this parabolic version of this Almgren's quantity as R goes to 0. In fact, I'm not describing what they are because they will come sometime later. And then our works are also inspired by monotonicity formulas that were found by Garofalo and Petrosian of Weiss and monotype when they studied the singular set for the Signorini problem for S equals to half. And then there are parabolic monotonicity formulas of the Poon type that came up in the work of Danieli, Garofalo, Petrosian, and Toh, who studied the same problem for A equals to 0. So what we do is study the non-zero A, because there the problem changes a lot because now you have a degenerate parabolic PD, so to speak. So the theory changes a lot in that sense. And then also our work is also inspired by some new monotonicity formulas that came up in my recent joint work with Nicola, where we studied the strong unit continuation for fractional parabolic equations for general S in 0 and 1. So there we found some new Poon type monotonicity formulas in this non-local situation. So in view of that, it was natural to look back at the problem that Danieli, Garofalo, Petrosian, and Toh studied and understand all the non-zero A case, or when S is not equal to half. So these are some of the notations. Again, I mean, I just don't want to bore you too much because it's overwhelmingly a lot. So I will have this thick dr, which will denote the thick ball in the joint variable x and y. And then I will have the thin ball, which is on the thin set where y equals to 0. Likewise, I will have a thick parabolic cylinder and a thin parabolic cylinder. And then I will have these time strips, a thick strip as well as a thin strip, depending on where the objects are situated. Now, unlike, I should mention that unlike Almgren, the Poon's functional is a global one. And so therefore, our obstacle problem that we have, we need to globalize it, and that is something we do by a cutoff. And the other thing which is very standard in this theory is that you subtract off the obstacle, and then you have a non-zero right-hand side, which is fairly standard in this theory. However, I should mention that when we want to study points of higher order of contact, we literally don't subtract off the obstacle. What we do is that we subtract off judiciously a certain order Taylor polynomial depending on the order of blow up at that free boundary point. And that again is dictated by how regular the obstacle is. So without getting into further details, let me just move on. So now that you have, but in a very naive way, let's assume that we have subtracted off the obstacle. So then, because now the cutoff is symmetric, so the weighted Neumann derivative does not change, and now we have zero obstacle problem. So we have zero obstacle problem because we have subtracted off the obstacle, that becomes the right-hand side. And so we have a similar condition on the free boundary or on the coincidence set, which are the Signorini information. And now it turns out that if you assume that the obstacle has good enough regularity in time, then that would in particular mean that this capital F has good enough regularity in time. And then you're able to observe that if you look at the time difference quotients, the positive and the negative part of the time difference quotients, they are subsolutions with some right-hand side. And then from the Moser type estimates, you would know that the time difference quotients are uniformly bounded in terms of the L2 norm of the time derivative of the time difference quotient, which so to speak is that which, as if you take the limit, you get that the time derivative is L infinity. So this is how we prove that the time derivative is L infinity. For S equals to half or A equals to 0, this was previously observed by Petrosian and Zeller, and also independently by Athanasopoulos, Caffarelli, and Milakis, but their estimates were again global. So before I go further, these are my notations. So the operator that I had, which is in that thick space, I will denote it by the script LA. And that operator, if you just open up this divergence from structure and take y to the A common, you realize that it has two parts. One is the Bessel operator, and the other is the Laplacian, which corresponds to the heat operator. Now, once you know that the time derivative is L infinity, what you do is that you move this time derivative to the right-hand side. And then at every time level, you have an elliptic problem. And now if you use the elliptic theory, and if you combine it with some uniformity estimates in time, you are able to get the optimal regularity of the solution in the parabolic sense. Now, I should mention over here is that in order to get uniform estimates in time, one has to have some appropriate regularity estimates for the free equation outside the coincidence set. Because outside the coincidence set, now that we have transformed to a zero obstacle problem, either you will have, or outside the free boundary, you will either have that you have a zero Dirichlet condition or a zero Neumann condition with a certain right-hand side. So then one would need to use interior estimates for such free equations. So if you combine it, only then you can get uniform estimates in time. And this is an aspect that had to be separately developed in our work. So we get the optimal regularity, which is HS half is nothing but the parabolic C1s spaces, where you scale the time and the space differently. So you take the linear scaling in space and you take the quadratic scalings in time. And this regularity is sharp because even in the elliptic case, you cannot get more. So, and now the kind of regularity that we have is that we know we have a certain optimal regularity, but that depends on the right-hand side, which is this F, and which depends on UT L infinity. But then again, by Moses estimates, you can get the L infinity norm of UT will depend on the L2 norm of L2 norm of UT plus the obstacle, right? Well, the obstacle is now anyway buried inside the right-hand side. But however, this is not good enough because when we do our blow-up analysis, that is when we zoom in near a free boundary point with respect to our scalings, we would need all the dependence on the L2 norm of U because of the nature of our rescaling and some order regularity of the obstacle. So at this point, what we have is a dependence which depends on the UT L2 norm. And this is something that we have to undo. And that is done by obtaining certain W22 type estimates that we develop in this situation that qualitatively uses the C1 alpha type regularity that we have for the solution. But in the end, you have dependence which only depends on the L2 norm of U. And as I said before, this local dependence is very crucial to our blow-up analysis. So now, because now we have globalized the problem, so this will be my notation for a global solution, which you are not expected to remember. And I don't even know how to pronounce it. And so you have, because you have taken a cutoff, so you will have bounded support. So you have some basic regularity in X and Y. Again, the regularity in X and Y are different. Only in the case when A equals to 0, they match, but otherwise they are different because of different homogeneities. And then you have that UT is an infinity, which is something we obtain. And then you have some second derivative estimates, which is to insist that gradient of UXI is an L2. Well, this should be rather L1 because I've taken a square over here. And then this Bessel, if you apply this Bessel operator to U, that should also be L2. So in the Kuhn's frequency, what comes up is the Gaussian for the heat equation. But now we have a degenerate parabolic PD. So we need the Gaussian corresponding to that. So now if you look at the degenerate parabolic PD, there are two parts. One is the Bessel part and the other is the heat part. So the total, as you know that if you take the Gaussian in n variables, you know that you can just multiply the Gaussian in one variable, and if you take the product, you recover the Gaussian in n variables. This is precisely that happens in this situation. So you have a y variable and the x variable, which are independent. You look at the Gaussian for this Bessel PD, and then you look at the Gaussian for the heat. And if you take the product, you recover the Gaussian for the total degenerate PD. Now, this Bessel PD has the Gaussian, which has this representation, and you see the appearance of this function, which is this I of A minus 1 by 2, where A is related to S in the manner that A equals to 1 minus 2S. So this is the, so to speak, modified Bessel function of second kind. So this is how the Gaussian would look like in our situation. And then if you take the pole at 0 for this fundamental solution, you have an expression which is 0.14, which looks like the standard Gaussian with a different power of t, so to speak. And that is again dictated by the homogeneity of this operator. So I will have these notations for parabolic dilations, that is you scale in the linear way in x and you scale in quadratic in time. And then you have this vector field z or z, which is the infinitesimal generator of the parabolic dilations. So then we have, now I describe the basic quantities in the Kuhn's frequency, and this is something that appears in my work with Nicola as well on unique continuation. So this is the height functional, this is the Dirichlet energy, and then you have this modified energy. Now, this I and D are related in the sense that if the right-hand side is 0, then if you integrate by parts and use the equation, you recover back D. And then you have this definition of Kuhn frequency, and likewise you have this n tilde. It is called the frequency because if you have a caloric function which is homogeneous of degree k, then you will have that z of u will be k of u because z is the generator of that family of dilations. And then if you plug that in, you will see that n of u has to be k because integral of u square by integral of u square, they get cancelled. So in that sense, it is a true frequency, so to speak. So now we want to look at the monotonicity. For that, we need to have the first variation for the numerator as well as the first variation for the denominator. So let me again look at the time again. Okay, so I will try to end quickly now. So we have a certain variation for the height, and then by a series of tedious computations, you have a certain variation for the energy. And now when you divide, what you get is this following Poon type monotonicity. So it's a truncated one because you have a right hand side. So if you have that, if you're, that the right hand side decays at a certain rate, then you have that if you look at this d by dr of log of max of h of r and this quantity plus something which has a limit as r goes to 0, this quantity is monotonically increasing or non-decreasing. So in particular, this has the limit as r goes to 0. Now, this may look like a very complicated expression, but if you had, say, the right-hand side was 0, then if you just look at d by dr of log of hr, that is nothing but the Poon frequency that we had, n or n tilde, up to a factor of r. So you recover back the one that you expect once you have homogeneous conditions. And so this so in particular, if you look at, so because it's monotone non-decreasing, so it has a limit as r goes to 0. And it turns out that this phi, L sigma, it does not differ from n or n tilde much. In fact, what you can show is that, so let me skip this, that not only this phi has a limit as r goes to 0, but that limit coincides with the limit of n as well as n tilde, because all these quantities, they differ by something which has a limit 0 as r goes to 0. So once you have this Poon type monotonicity, you start zooming in the picture. You take the parabolic scalings and then you divide by this height function to a square root. And then I would also need another rescalings when I finally study the singular points, which are the homogeneous scaling, so to speak. Now, what you do is that if you take UR square and then multiply with the Gaussian and integrate by change of variable formula, you notice that h of UR of 1 equals to 1. And now if you combine it with our regularity estimates, that gives you some compactness of the sequence UR as R goes to 0. And you see very clearly over here as to why I was kind of insisting that all our regularity estimates should only depend on the L2 norm of U, because that is the only information that you can fetch out of these rescalings. So we critically needed that. And we have the following scale invariance of the frequency. And now, by a certain globe analysis and some compactness arguments that where we crucially use the local regularity estimates that we previously obtained, we are able to show that this UR goes to some U0. And one of the key quantities that plays a very crucial role is this so-called W22 type estimates, but in the Gaussian spaces. And these are fairly delicate because, and these are based on some old ideas of Fabes and Stroop or Fabes, Garofalo, and Lanconelli, which suggests that once you're in the Gaussian space, then the parabolic PD lends itself an elliptic structure, so to speak. So anyway, with these W22 type estimates as well as the C1 alpha type estimates, you are able to show that UR goes to some U0. So if you now look at this NUR row and NUR row, if you let R goes to 0, you will have NU at 0 plus, which is this, which is some K. And then on this side, if you let R goes to 0, you get NU0 of rho equals to K. And you are able to show that U0 solves a homogeneous problem. And because now you have shown that the frequency of U0 is constant, which is K, then that tells you that by our previous considerations that U0 is homogeneous of degree K. And it's a global solution to this thin obstacle problem. Now, let me also mention another subtlety, and that is something which is very specific to the parabolic case and that leads to certain complications, is the fact that now all these quantities are weighted with respect to this Gaussian. And this is not defined as t equals to 0. So initially what we have is that we get only convergence away from time t equals to 0. But finally our free boundary point is situated once you translate at t equals to 0. So you would want to recover the information over there. And that is something that we obtain in this case by a global submean value type inequality, or so to speak, the Tikhonov type comparison. And that crucially uses the asymptotics of the fundamental solution and how the asymptotics of the Bessel function, which is involved in the definition of the fundamental solution, is. And that's sort of a delicate analysis that finally leads us to the conclusion that this limit is also defined all the way up to t equals to 0. And now, given the fact that ut is bounded, you're able to show that the minimal frequency is 1 plus s with respect to the parabolic scaling. And at points of minimal order of contact, we are able to show using this boundedness of the time derivative that the blow-up limits are time independent. And the other thing is that, and from there we are also able to derive that the other frequencies are bigger than equal to 2. So therefore you see that there is a gap of the frequency. There is a minimal order, which is 1 plus s, and then the higher orders are bigger than equal to 2. So from this you are able to conclude, because you have some continuity information of the frequencies, that the set of free boundary points which have minimal frequency is a relatively open subset of the free boundary. Now over here you would be tempted to use the elliptic theory and say that at every time level you can represent it as a C1 alpha graph, but then you will not have a uniform estimates in time, and so you would not be able to conclude that graph has any regularity in time. So in order to overcome that, what we instead do is we adapt and so let me first define what a regular part is. So the regular part of the free boundaries are points where the frequency is 1 plus s. So what we are able to show is that the regular free boundary is a C1 alpha hypersurface. That is, you can represent it as a C1 alpha graph. As I said, that you cannot just use the Caffarelli-Salsa-Sylvester results, because you would not have any uniform regularity estimates of the free boundary in time. So instead, what we do is that we adapt the epiperimetric approach, which in this setting was first established by Garofalo, Petrosian, Camelia Pop, and Mariana Spinz-Vega Garcia. And with that, we are able to combine it with some sharp non-degeneracy estimates. And then by using the fact that ut is bounded, we are able to get some basic regularity of this free boundary time. And I should not, so anyway, I will just not elaborate any further because I have very limited time now. So I'll just go through the rest of the slides very quickly. And then, so again, as I said, that the problem of high regularity of the free boundary is open, but nevertheless, once we have this basic regularity, we now turn our attention to the singular free boundary points. So the singular free boundary points are defined as those where the coincidence set has zero density, similar to that of the classical obstacle problem. And then now, unlike the classical obstacle problem where you have that the only frequency is 2, but in the thin obstacle problem, you can have varying frequencies. So we then classify singular free boundary points based on the homogeneity of the blow up. So we call sigma k, where the blow up is k, or the blow up has a homogeneity k. And it turns out that there are examples to show that the singular free boundary point can be very large. So it is kind of justified as to why one wants to understand the regularity of the singular set, so to speak. So the first thing that we show out of some Liouville type theorems that we developed, combined with some unique continuation results that I previously had with Nicola, we have the following equivalent characterization of singular points. So singular points are those where you have that the coincidence set has zero density, or equivalently, you have that the blow up are k homogeneous polynomials, which are symmetric in Y. And you can also equivalently characterize as points where the limit is an even integer, and they are all equivalent. So then, to study the singular points, what we need is a Weiss type monotonicity in this setting. So you see that this is the quantity D and H that appears in the definition of Almgren or Kuhn. So this Weiss monotonicity gives you information about the rate at which the Almgren rescalings converge to the blow-up limit. So able to show that this Wk, so to speak, is monotone. So in particular, it has a limit as R goes to 0. And now the other monotonicity that you also need is the so-called antiderivative of Weiss, which is the monotype monotonicity. So where you have this quantity and you have a global solution to the obstacle problem, and then if you look at this scale invariant quantity at near such points, then this quantity is monotone. So unlike Weiss, what mono tells you is that it gives you information on the rate at which the homogeneous scalings converge to the blow-up limit. And this is important, right? Because if you want to understand singular points, if you only looked at the Almgren scalings, you would not get much information about the tangent plane, because potentially what may happen is that you have a discontinuity at the top, which is in terms of u, which is u of del r, and then you divide it by h of u. So that also has an intrinsic dependence in u. So potentially what may happen is that you have a discontinuity at the top and the bottom, and they may cancel one another. So that may not fetch you much information of the free boundary near singular points. So what you would need is the homogeneous scaling. So that is, you take u of delta r divided by r to the k, And that gives you a lot more information about how the blow-up limit changes across the singular free boundary. So with this type monotonicity, what you are able to show is that the homogeneous scaling, they converge to some homogeneous blow-ups, and the homogeneous blow-ups are first of all unique, and that is something you can quite easily extract out of the monotype monotonicity. And the second thing being, there is a continuous dependence of the blow-up from the free boundary points. And this is quite cool, because once you have this, and then if you check some basic compatibility conditions, then if you look at these homogeneous polynomials that occur at blow-up limits, by using some Whitney extension theorem, you can realize them as Taylor polynomials of a sufficiently smooth function f. And then you attach the dimension at singular points in this manner. And as I said, because of the Whitney extension, this would correspond to the kernel of a certain order derivative of a reasonably smooth function f. And this is kind of tailor-made for applying the implicit function theorem. So based on that, you have the following stratification that depending on the dimension of the singular set, you have that the singular points are contained in a countable union of d plus 1 dimensional C1 manifolds. And the top dimension, in fact, and it's quite interesting, is contained in a countable union of time-like C1 manifolds. So with this, I would like to end my talk. And these are the two relevant papers. And I would like to thank you all for your kind attention. So that's all.
Thank you, Agnit, for a very nice talk. So if anyone has questions, please ask now. You unmute yourself and ask.
That was a lot. It was a lot to take in. Thank you.
Is there some question? If you can kindly speak up a bit, because I was not able to hear.
No, I just said that was a lot to take in. So I don't think I have.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. It's understandable because they kind of combined the information that kind of we had in two papers. I just thought that this has some geometry. So I just wanted to speak on that. Had it just been PD, may have appeared dry to a larger audience.
Can you just say where these fractional obstacle problems arise?
Where the obstacle problems arise for this non-local operators, well, I mean, they arise in a variety of contexts. One would be the elasticity, which corresponds to the half case, where you would want to minimize the direction energy. And
there seems to be something. Krishna, can you do something?
Sorry?
Okay.
I think I unmute myself.
Yeah, sorry. Can you start again? Because there was some...
Okay, so the thing is that one model problem, again, that's kind of an outside motivation, which is to say that if you specialize to the case when s equals to half, what you recover, at least in the flat case, that is equivalent to the synodic problem, which is really a simplified version of a problem in elasticity. But besides that, these problems appear in other contexts where you have non-local diffusions like quasi-geostrophic equations. And then instead, where you look at obstacle problems where now you have not sort of continuous Brownian motions, but you have these Levi processes with jumps. So, and it's again a very kind of a model problem where you would want to see what what happens in a non-local analog of the classical obstacle problem. That is, once you have this non-variational characterization, that is the least, is the envelope of all super solutions that lies above an obstacle. So you want to understand what is the geometry of the interface and so on. And the problem, and again, in the parabolic case, this problem also appears in other contexts like osmosis and a few other contexts as well. But again, I would not elaborate much on that because I'm not very knowledgeable on that front.
Okay.
For us, it's more like a variation and inequality, and then we want to understand how much of the regularity you can sort of, or how much of analysis you can develop in this context.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, so I think maybe there are no more questions. So let's thank Agnit again for a nice talk.
All right, thanks, Krishna.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
All right.